Hi, thank you all for coming today. I'm so glad to see everybody here. I'm Elizabeth, I'm the Adult Services Director, and I'm so glad that we have Denise Lincoln here today to talk to us about slaves from the area who enlisted in the war.
Those rowdy boys in the back, you know.
I'm sorry I was noisy back there. Repeat that again, I'll be quiet. Thank you.
Okay. Denise is a local author, a historian, and a friend to the library, and I'm thank you so much, Denise, for coming to the library and talking to us about the subject of your next book.
My next book, my first. I need, you know, to be an author, you have to be published. Although I'm working on that. Hi.
Hi.
Good to see you today. She's got this thing going. I'm just going to let you know that it's going to be videotaped, but I don't want that to hold any of us back. Because I told her, I said, you know, if this goes off the rails, we have the right to pull it back, right? So we're going to deal with some interesting but sensitive materials. But I want you to feel free to give it back to me, call me down, call me up, whichever way it comes together. But don't let the camera intimidate you, okay? Everybody agreed to that? Okay. I'll try not to, too. So, we're going to talk about 150 years ago. In the last few years, we have been celebrating or remembering or pretending like we're soldiers and thinking about the old days and a difficult time in our country's history, a difficult time in Missouri history, and a difficult time in Cape Girardeau history. Civil War was a time of great clash of values and ideas, the sorting out of righting wrongs. It was a time when some people felt very violated because their property was gone, and people who had lived their life as property finally had life. So it was a total social upheaval. Many of you live in Cape and have lived here a long, long time. Cape Girardeau has some Civil War history, but I'm not going to presume you know it. So we're going to have a pop quiz. Sorry. You know the answers. I gave this talk a little earlier, so some of this is repeat for Judy. So I won't play to Judy. I'm going to talk to the rest of you. She's just going to get it twice. You might recognize this as the flood mural downtown, downtown Cape Girardeau, and the panels that depict this particular era of our community history. So, what else do you know about Civil War history in Cape Girardeau? Quick, we got to go through this fast because the good stuff is yet to come.
4 forts.
4 forts. The one that we know the best is the one that remains, partly intact, partly enhanced, but this is Fort D, down in the South Cape neighborhood, about 2 blocks off of Sprigg. It's actually on Fort Street, but nobody knows where Fort Street is. Do you know? Yeah. Okay. And what remains of the fort is not really what it was like much. This stone building was not there. This grand entrance was not there. It was primarily, and of course the markers, although they're helpful to us now, were not there. And the sidewalks were not there. It was basically an earthen encampment that they threw up these earth berms all the way around to protect the south end of Cape Girardeau. What goes on the east side of Cape Girardeau? Mississippi River. Why would that be important? It's the big highway of the time. And during Civil War, troops moving up and down, supplies moving up and down, enemies clashing at the river. It was important who controlled the river. And so the four forts came into existence, and we're looking at Fort D, the fourth of the four, because Cape Girardeau was an occupied city. Although it's a little southern, it's a lot southern in its mindset and temperament and worldview of those days. Because of its strategic place on the Mississippi River, in southern Missouri, next to Arkansas to the south, and on the river, it was important to the Union troops. And so the Union troops said, you know, we need to have a stronghold in Cape Girardeau. And in it was June of 1861, they came in force. Lots of Union soldiers came and rotated in and out of Cape Girardeau, but it was an occupied city. And so one of the occupation places was Fort D. Miss Ruth is a reenactor, and she does a lot of things. What was the important thing about Fort D?
Protected the south, also protected the river, but the river was blocked at Carroll. We
Okay.
had control of the river.
Okay.
Carroll North.
Okay. And they do, in case you want to relive some of this stuff, you guys do reenactments out there. You put a big cannon out there. Have you ever been there? If you know where it is. Okay. The holidays, Labor Day, Memorial Day, 4th of July, they have reenactors out there. Fort A, so there was a Fort D. It's going to be A, B, C, D, okay? For those of you that are doing the pop quiz. Fort A, any idea where that was? Okay. So we're still on the eastern side of the city. On the northern end, Bellevue Street, which is two streets north of Broadway. There's
Limbaugh lives.
I'm sorry?
Where Steve Limbaugh lives,
Oh,
It's one street.
at the end of the street.
one street off Broadway. Okay, one street north of Broadway. Big Bluff on that side of things too. A nice overview of the river. This was actually the headquarters encampment. All the orders came and went from there, and this windmill was pre-existing to the encampment, and it shows in some lithographs of the city in earlier times. Fort B. Okay, we're at the college. There's two generations of markers. This kind of stone marker with a brass placard on it, I think those were placed by the Rotary Club. I'm not sure when, probably the 30s. This is in the median, just across from Academic Hall. And the fort was actually where the Kent Library is now. And that was where they had a lot of big cannons and stuff going there too. And then Fort C. And that was kind of the outer edge of town. You know, Fort B and C were kind of the western edge of town at that time. Of course, Cape Girardeau's gone a lot farther west in today's world. But this is at the corner of Good Hope and Pacific. Some of you might remember the old St. Francis Hospital was on that site for many, many, many decades. I think they tore that down in the 90s, and then they built these apartment complex. And I was encouraged when I saw what they chose to name the complex is Fort, harkening back to Civil War days, and Hope, probably pulling from Good Hope Street. So, the four forts. These are the more modern placards that you see around town. This one actually is on the lawn of the middle school, on Carruthers and whatever that little spur is. Thank you, Thelenius. There's a similar one on the lawn of Kent Library as well. So if you really are into battle maps and generals and strategic stuff, spend some time reading that. That's not what this talk is about. The Battle of Cape Girardeau was a fairly widespread geographic area. This placard tells us that Bloomfield on the south and Perryville Road, left and right flanks of that battle. This marker actually sits at the corner of Broadway and what is that little street on the on the west side of Grace Methodist Church.
Oh, Carruthers?
No, that's
Broadway and Carruthers.
the other
Oh,
side.
that other one.
Anyway, here's McDonald's.
Yeah.
You see it up there? Okay. That's where that marker stands. And that says that was kind of the center of the battle. And it says in front of this house, well, the house isn't there anymore, but time goes on, you know, and things get torn down.
After McDonald's or before?
Well, which way are you going on Broadway?
Towards Kings Island.
Before you get to McDonald's.
It's on the left.
Where was that first one that was in more details? That one?
Well, there's two of them, and they're identical. One is on the lawn of the middle school
Okay.
at Carruthers and Thelonious, and also the lawn of Kent Library. Okay? And they're really good maps and in detail. And there is a travel folder, brochure of sites of Cape Girardeau and Civil War. Well, if you're like me, I didn't grow up in Cape, but I've lived here 30 years. That was kind of the extent of my Civil War Cape Girardeau knowledge. And I thought, what more can be said? What more do you want to know? You know, we have one big battle in April of 1863. Otherwise, it was just an occupation. Union soldiers rotating in and out. Most of those soldiers that came appointed to Cape Girardeau Post, is what they called it, came from Wisconsin, Iowa, Nebraska. They rotated in and out. There were a few locally raised militias, and both for the Union and for the Confederacy. Outlying Cape Girardeau were bands of Confederate guerrilla groups, not that kind. Guerrillas meaning that they weren't regular army regiments, but they were kind of taking advantage of the war and say, you know, this is a good reason to raise hell, you know, and rape and pillage and shoot my gun and make people nervous. That's the work of a guerrilla, and there were lots of that going out toward Bloomfield, New Madrid, and up into Perry County, around Jackson. Lots of that kind of skirmishing and challenges, some challenges and threats to the Union soldiers occupying Cape Girardeau, but for the most part, blah. Okay? Then my interest in this, I am the most unlikely person to be standing here, in my own estimation, giving a lecture about Civil War. It's not what I thrive on. 3 years ago, this quote became kind of a shift in my life. Sometimes life takes us where we never expect to go, and in those places, God writes a story we never thought would be ours. Well, what happened? My husband and I decided 7 years ago that we would make a career shift. My husband works in the medical field. He has the option to do that as a traveler. And we thought, what the heck? Let's travel. And so for the last 7 years, we've been gypsies and come back to Cape Girardeau between assignments, but we're gone a great deal of the time. One of the wonderful places we got to go was 6 months to Alexandria, Virginia, which is just a short train ride across the Potomac River to Washington, D.C. At that time, once I disengaged myself from my life, what am I going to do with all this free time? I became involved in my own family tree and understanding family heritage, and as we've traveled, that was able to inform that. I decided if I was going to be a real historian, a real genealogist, I needed to get out from behind the computer. Although lots is available by way of the internet, I wanted a more authentic experience. I wanted to get into the stuff of history. So I decided to cut my teeth on learning to research things through the National Archives. It's intimidating. It's not easy. It's bewildering. But there's a lot of people available to guide you through it. So one day I got brave and I went to the Pennsylvania Avenue side of that building and walked in that door, went through all the screening, got all my credentials, and began to say, look at what's available. I was researching family history, and the archives has a lot of stuff, more stuff than could ever fit in that building or 10 others. And through the years, they have begun to take photographs of historic documents and make those available on microfilm. Ever done any research with microfilm? It can be a real headache kind of experience. But you take this reel, and it's full of documents that they've taken images of, and you read it on a screen. I had been researching family. I had been going to the same room of this big cavernous room of cabinet after cabinet of microfilm storage drawers, and you get creature of habit. I thought I was in the right place, opening the right drawer, and lo and behold, I didn't open the right drawer, and when I opened it, I realized, oh, this is not where I'm supposed to be. But as I was closing that drawer, my eye scanned across the labels on all of those microfilm boxes, and for whatever reason, my eye saw Cape Girardeau. Well, I'm a long way from home. And, well, that's serendipitous. I've opened this drawer, and there's Cape Girardeau. So I took a closer look. Little bitty white box, label at the top, says USCT, Cape Girardeau, Missouri. I do not immediately know what USCT is. Do you? Some United States colored troop. I didn't know that. I didn't know that but I was curious. So I thought, well, that's not what I'm here for, but I'm curious what is on this microfilm roll. I took that roll, put it on the machine, and began to look at documents like this. This, again, is an image. Somebody took a photograph of a piece of paper, a standardized form, says colored volunteer descriptive list of Alexander Gibney. Colored volunteers enlisted in the service of the United States under General Order number 135, Headquarters, Department of the Missouri, St. Louis, November 14th, 1863. Claimed to have been the slave of Andrew Gibney, a citizen of Cape Girardeau County, state of Missouri. And then in this middle section, again, they put his name, and then his physical description. I think that's 27. Sometimes the handwriting is really hard to decipher, and so, yeah, I have to go back and look again and again. His eyes are black, his hair is black, his complexion is yellow. For those of us that don't live and breathe in skin tones other than white middle class, help me unload that. What comes to mind when it's does that mean he's Chinese? No. Help me here. Come on.
He looks like me.
Okay. He's a lighter skinned African American, and it's interesting. We're looking at just one, but this is filled out by a provost marshal in Cape Girardeau, and he is given. This is in the days before photo IDs. Okay. He's got to create on this paper some kind of physical description of this man. And this guy, W.P. Owens, is pretty consistent in what he does with describing skin tone. Other places, other enlistment sites will use copper, mulatto. Some will say, I'm trying to think of some other descriptors. They're not coming to mind. But most often, the skin tone is also black. But this gives us some hint that somewhere in Alexander's DNA, there's probably Caucasian blood. I'll let you figure out how that might have happened. We have kids in the audience. 5'7" tall, born in the state of Missouri, county of Cape Girardeau. His occupation was a farmer. He enlisted, this is this, oh, I have a pointer. Oh, there we go. Enlisted December 22nd, 1863 in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and then it gives his enlistment officer, which is W.P. Owen, for a period of 3 years. Now, I'm just at the edge of my curiosity at this point. I don't really know what I'm looking at. I don't live and breathe Civil War. I don't breathe in military, but I thought, I'm on to something here. And I went through several. Here's Noah Randall. Noah was the slave of Samuel Randall, Cape Girardeau, Missouri. Here's another, Stanhope. Well, I want to go back to Noah just a minute. Noah is 44 years old. Kind of old, I think, but nonetheless, he was enlisted.
You're saying that their name is the same as who they work for?
Yeah. Do they take
Just a minute.
Okay.
Good questions. Good questions. Here's Stanhope Kendall. He's 18. He's got black eyes, black hair, black complexion, 5'3", born in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. You know, I looked at dozens of these, and I'm reading names, surnames like Rainey, Randall, Gibney. I could go on. But they're names that I recognize. I'm not native Cape Girardeau, but they're names of our streets. I live on Henderson. There was a Henderson.
Randall too, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean,
subdivisions of Gibney and
I'm just my jaw is dropping at this point. I'm realizing I am reading something that I had no context for. You've noticed the surnames. I want to take you in your mind's eye back 150 years. You're standing at the courthouse at the top of, well, it's right across the street from your house. Where am I? The Common Police Courthouse downtown. You know where we are?
Yeah.
Okay, in your mind's eye, take off the cupola, take off the wings. It's just a brick 2-story building, but it is the courthouse. It's been in operation for about 6 years. That is the enlistment point. Even though the Fort A is the headquarters, if you're going to enlist, you're going to do anything of official importance, you're doing it with the provost marshal, and it's at the courthouse. Here are these black men approaching the courthouse. The courthouse on which the steps and the yard of which have hosted countless slave auctions. The courthouse is not a place of justice or protection or safety. It is the white man's injustice to your family and your tradition. But they're coming to the courthouse, and they're putting their, I don't have an enlistment paper here. I failed to do that. But they're presenting themselves for enlistment into the Union Army. When he woke up that morning, even if he had been in Cape Girardeau a while, and this was the case, we're in 1863. The war has been going on for 2 years up to this point. Missouri is a mess. We'll just suffice it to say that. It's a political mess. It's an economic mess. Food is getting scarce. Resources are getting scarce. Cape Girardeau is an occupied city, occupied by invaders in your mind. If you lived in Cape Girardeau at that point, more than likely you are southern, have a southern point of view, although there were competing political points of view in Cape Girardeau. There were people who advocated the end of slavery and were abolitionists and were working toward that end, but for as many of them, there were many more who were either slaveholders, whether they were Unionists for the Union, or Confederates or Southern leaning. There was a mass of people and points of view. But these men have escaped their bondage. And every story is different. And the more I study one by one, the more you find. But they came to this enlistment of their own free will, and they're going through the military enlistment. When he woke up this morning, Stanhope was Henry Kendall's Stanhope. He had no last name.
That's right.
He was Henry Kendall's property.
That's right.
And when the enlistment, and this is some of the early days of this happening, I can imagine the tension at the table. The black man approaches the table, the provost marshal says, "What is your name, sir?" Stanhope has to have a name. And Stanhope has been his name, but what's his surname going to be? So in a split second, he needs to choose one. And for better or for worse, he chose his owner's name. And now, once he's on a federal form, I don't know if you've ever done federal paperwork, but you're that now. Now there's this, in some cases, some of these men changed that name, but for the most part, in this enlistment set of records, we find the formerly enslaved, and he was enslaved that morning, but with his enlistment, he has become technically a free man in constrained freedom, because now he's enlisted in the Army for 3 years, and I don't know if any of you have military service, but I don't think that's real free. But that's what he's going to do.
So you're saying that his master gave him permission to go and, no, he just left?
Who knows?
Right, okay.
In December, it could be a mix of things. And I don't have time to go into all of that, but it is an evolution. What I discovered that day I opened the wrong drawer were all the men that had joined in late 1863 and early 1864. Missouri had begun to kind of sort out what it was going to do about black soldiers. And actually, the reason that this form, this is a printed form. The provost marshal had a stack of these blank ones, and he's filling it out. In November, that's why this date is up here, Missouri had decided that they were going to go ahead. The commander in St. Louis, John Schofield, who was commander of the Department of the Missouri, headquartered in St. Louis, sent out a general order and said, "We are enlisting black men." And at this point in December, and this is where it's painful, but Henry might have given his permission for Stanhope to be there that day. And the reason that they even put Henry's name on it was that with this general order, there was a provision for Henry to get the last dollar for Stanhope's value. The state and the federal government, the federal Union Army at that point, had made provision that if the slave owner had all the paperwork, just so, sometime in the near future they could apply what's called a slave claim and possibly get up to $300 for the surrender of their slave in the service of the federal government.
Always about money.
Now, to put that in perspective, Noah Randall is one of my favorite guys. He was one of the first I ever researched. And he lays in a grave right over there. And so you need to go visit him sometime before we leave, or maybe as you go home. But Noah the older man, 44, I found his bill of sale. It was submitted by Samuel Rando when he was applying for his slave claim. Noah had been sold, I think it was in 1853, to Samuel. He was 36 years old. I might have the dates wrong, but when he was 36, he was sold to Samuel. The bill of sale that advertised the handbill advertising the slave auction had him listed as being a value of $900. He was sold at auction, a bidding, I'll give this, I'll give that. When he was sold to Samuel, he was sold for, I think, $1,150 some dollars. It's in a later slide. So he was a pretty strong guy, you know, in the peak of his health, even at 36, which in those days, but he must have really been a sturdy guy and must have been able to do a lot of good hard work. And the fact that I do know he lives through the Civil War, which is an accomplishment of itself, especially as an African-American man, because of disease. He lived and survived that. So I know he was a hale and hearty guy. And so what happened between 1856, when, I think this is the date, when Noah was purchased by Samuel for $1,100, by 1863, the value had gone actually down to $200. If you're talking just the economy of it, and it's painful for me to say that because I don't think anybody should have a value on their head. But if you're talking about being a slave holder and the value of your investment, it's worse than the economy that we've just lived through, where property values have fallen. You know, there was no market for it anymore. Thank God. You know, if nothing else, the economy of it brought it to an end. But so the $300 offer by the government as a slave claim was some incentive. Back to your question, did Henry bring him? I don't know. I doubt it. There's a lot of evidence that these men, what I call self-emancipated, they saw the opportunity coming together, made their way at great risk from hills and hollers, farms all around the county, and made their way to Cape, which, you know, was just not a free ride. You know, you caught out without papers, and there was all kinds of people patrolling for runaways at that point. There still was slave trade in the South, and that was happening at this time, where posses of men would run up and down the county roads looking for runaways to snatch them up and send them south because they could get more money for them there. So they came to Cape Girardeau, to the enlistment table, at great personal risk.
I had heard there was a railroad that took people from here to Safer Land. Now, was that the black people, or was
Well, there is what's called the Underground Railroad, which was not a railroad necessarily. Sometimes it connected to a physical railroad, but it was a system of escape. And there is some evidence of that, although it doesn't relate to this story at this point. So I came home with my head full of 97 men. I made PDF images of all of those descriptive lists that I found on that microfilm that day, because I knew I was onto something. And I thought, well, you know, there's just an awful lot of history that Denise doesn't know, but maybe the common folk does know. But I made my PDFs. I had my list, and I'll share later if you want to see that. Made a spreadsheet, the slave names, the slave holders' names, and there's just lots and lots of names that you would recognize. Lots. And so, not wanting to stir it up unnecessarily, because now we're getting into people's business, you know, and especially those generational families that have lived here for generations. To say, oh, I Either, oh, I know you were a slave of, or I know your family owned, that's not kind of McDonald's conversation, So I wanted to be respectful of the story, but I was incensed that the story was not common story. I came home, I came to the library, I pulled all these historic documents that are out there, some old. Goodspeed's History of Southeast Missouri is from 1888. Felix Snyder's Cape Girardeau Biography of a City, 1956. And then, of course, Morley Swingle's fictional depiction, may I underscore fictional, depiction of Cape Girardeau, although it's a good read, and it kind of gives you a perspective, The Gold of Cape Girardeau, as well as publications put together by the County Historical Archives and the Cape Girardeau Genealogical Society, Hearts of Blue and Gray, cut off some of these others, but did I find any history of Civil War black enlistments?
No.
What?
No.
Of course not. I did not.
No, ma'am.
So then I realized,
Read my lips.
let's unpack that a little bit. Why would that not exist? Why are there not markers? I mean, we can go down to the courthouse today, and there's the Confederate Memorial. There's the Union. Is that a Union soldier on top of that fountain? Okay, so we kind of got that base covered. But why would not? And I will say at this point I'm up to I think about 276, 77. I don't know. Ruth keeps bringing me more names. Men, African American men who had some military start in Cape Girardeau. That's the scope of my project. So, that's a sizable amount of people. Why is this story not here? Help me.
They
You're
weren't
talking about the
accepted.
disenfranchised.
Okay, meaning,
People on the lower end of the pendulum, the social economic
okay,
ladder.
it's a minority.
Minority.
It's a marginalized historically, and let's be honest, current day, majority rules, right? That's the American way. If you're white, Caucasian, middle class, you set the agenda. And if you're not that, your story is marginalized. And then and I'm not saying, I'm saying that's what it is, right?
Right.
Let's hear it from the amen corner back there. It's not right. But what comes forward is what is told. Who's writing the story? In many cases, it's white males writing the story. They write white male history. And here I'm white female, and I want to tell a different story. I have many friends in this community whose stories need to be told along with the others. And so, but I go to the sources, it's not there. Well, let's talk about one other aspect of why the story is not there. Not only did these men, well, they weren't writers. And that was another fact of life of Missouri. If you were African American Missourian, you were denied by law the privilege to learn to read and write. Some did with the help of compassionate others, but for the most part, if you knew how to read and write, you didn't publish it or wave a flag and say, I know. That was part of the plan. It was part of the slave society, the slave culture, to keep people oppressed, feeling that if you know how to read and write, then you're going to know that maybe freedom could be had, or that there was another way. And so it was another device to oppress. The other thing is that after the Civil War, there was a few decades of potential. We find African American men being elected to public office, serving in leadership positions, and there was a growing surge of freedmen who embraced freedom and flew with it. But that didn't last long, partly because, in my opinion, the majority white community felt a little invaded, a little pushed, and felt like we still need to keep those people, quote, where they belong. And so then you began to see the building of Jim Crow type laws and ordinances. Again, you know, we're glad you're free. We're glad, but we want you to do your life and we'll continue ours, and we don't want you to invade leadership and community building and those things that have brought modern society forward. So those stories in that environment get suppressed. I've checked with many African American families to say, what do you know of your family history? And for the most part, not much. Do you know your family goes back to Civil War? No, I have no idea. And I think that's part of the coping, part of the strength, part of the resilience. When you have come from oppression, let's not look back. Let's not recall the pain of the past. Let's look forward. And so when that becomes the family, sit around the table talk, how can we progress? How can we go forward? You don't talk a lot about the past. And those aren't family stories that get passed and reserved and revered. And so they fade. In my research, I have found 3 periods of black enlistments in Cape Girardeau, and it's a fairly narrow window. The very first enlistment that I found that occurred in Cape Girardeau happened on June the 8th, 1863. That is pretty early in all of the black regiments that organized for the Union Army. Out in Massachusetts, you might have seen movies. Anybody seen Glory? Okay. A lot of the photographs that if you go on the Library of Congress website or the Brady photographs and some of the photographs from the Civil War area, if you find a picture of a black soldier, it will probably be out east or north. And of course, the 54th Massachusetts, is the famous one, and they're the ones that the movie was made about, and it wasn't an easy thing, but they were probably the most famous of the fighting and battle-hardened African American soldiers that we know about. But here in Missouri, I told you it's a mess, and I'm not going to go into it unless you really want to know it, but it's not appropriate here. But June is pretty early. Missouri had no real provision or plan. It was kind of an accident. And then when it happened, it's like, what are we going to do? They enlisted soldiers here in Cape Girardeau, about 75 of them. And the majority of them up in St. Louis. That was a bigger drawing area. If you were an escaped slave, you went to St. Louis. Bigger city, more soldiers, more opportunity. And so they organized a whole regiment between Cape Girardeau and St. Louis and didn't know what to call them or where to send them. And they actually went forward in history known as an Arkansas regiment. But I'm straightening that one out. Then it kind of subsided. The folks in St. Louis, actually they were expecting that Missouri would, let me go back. January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. We're free. unless you live in Missouri.
Right.
And actually, that Emancipation Proclamation, for as brave and as cutting edge as it was, really didn't do much. It freed the slaves of the South. Who's going to enforce that? If you lived in Missouri, we weren't the South. We weren't the North. We were a border state. And it had nothing to do with the slaves in Missouri. So the enlistment of these men in June through September was kind of riding that wave, but then it got cut off because it just wasn't legal. There was no state provision for this, and there was really not yet a military provision.
I just had a question. You said it didn't apply to Missouri.
Yeah.
The proclamation was a nationwide proclamation, right? No?
No.
It was specific to particularly just to the South.
Yeah.
It didn't apply at all in the northern states.
Well, they were technically already free.
Yeah.
Just the states that had seceded.
But the language actually specifically said the South.
Yeah.
Didn't
The states in rebellion.
In rebellion.
Yeah.
I didn't realize
It was
Yeah.
the 14th Amendment, the recent movie of Lincoln, that extended it to all slaves.
Yeah, you know, we get hazy. Everything kind of loses focus 150 years apart. But yeah, we think Lincoln freed the slaves. Well, when you get down to the technicalities of it all, it really wasn't as big a deal yet as it purported to be. So they cut off. I think there was a whole regiment, about 1,000 men who had been recruited from June to September, and then they cut it off, said this is not going to happen anymore. All kinds of political infighting going on. And then those documents that I showed you, the descriptive list and the general order by John Schofield opened the door again. It opened again briefly from December 1st through February 20th. That's what happened here in Cape. And these were the men who might have come to the table with their slave owners. Not likely. I still think that there was a lot of self-emancipation running, taking matters in my own hands and getting myself to Cape so I can do that. But they did fill out the paperwork so that, and this is where we know so much of the white and the black story and the mixing of histories at this point. In that group, there was 97 men. And then later in the summer of 1864, there was another group that had been recruited from all over Cape Girardeau, all over the state, but then there was some specific recruiting and enlistment that happened here in Cape Girardeau, and there were 66 men there. I also looked in the federal census of 1890, there was a special sheet that was filled out in every county that was called the Veterans Schedule. And that was an interesting reveal to me. These were the old men at that point, the old veterans that were still living in the county. They wanted to kind of have a listing of who was still alive, who had served during the Civil War. And so I think Cape Girardeau has maybe a 10-page county roster of men. And man, you got to really pour through that very closely. But some of these African American men do appear there, not many, but they were here, and I've been able to glean a few more from there. All total, I'm trying to write biographical sketches for about 267 men. Many of the men who joined this, the 56th USCI and the 65th USCI, many of those men, 4.5 out of 10 died of disease during their 3-year enlistment. The other thing to recognize about these men is that they were not signing up for state militias. This was federal army. And when the Civil War was over in 1865, those state militias and cavalry units and what else did they call them? Artillery units. When the war was over, they kissed each other on the cheek and said, "Goodbye, I'm going home." These men signed up for 3-year enlistments. And when their duty was over, when the war was over, their duty went on. And these men, when that reality hit, that was kind of devastating. And I have found some really, really gripping letters written by some of these men during their enlistment. Why can't we go home? Everybody else has gone home. Well, they were dependent on to staff much of the reconstruction efforts in the years immediately following the Civil War. Now, this is the 54th Massachusetts. There aren't many pictures. But then this is killing me because I'm really doing a lot of research, but I can't find many pictures that are truly local that depict the men of this region. But this is a good representative picture. I love the look on their faces.
That is that's the actual 54th
Yeah.
Massachusetts. Wow.
Yeah.
Where'd you?
It's Library of Congress picture. It's pretty stock. If anybody's doing any research or writing on this topic, you're going to probably see this picture. It's larger. There's more. But I wanted to zoom in on these men's faces. What do you see there?
Confusion.
They just doubt, they don't know what to expect.
Firmness.
This guy.
Guy is very
Yeah,
firm.
I'm
Yeah.
ready to go.
I see a calm confidence in his face. You know, some are kind of smirky. Some are like, "Oh, what's next?" And I don't say that to disparage any of these. You tell me any young recruit soldier that's going to stand up and know what they're facing.
They sure look young.
The gentleman behind the one that seemed confident
Oh.
kind of looks confident too.
This one?
Yeah, right back
Yeah.
there. I mean, he doesn't have that.
Well, this is all new. All new. The life that they have lived to this point, although frankly, these are guys from Massachusetts, so it really doesn't count. But I felt like we can't just talk about it. We gotta look in their eyes and put ourselves in their position. Now, this quote came from a St. Louis newspaper. Those first men that joined in Cape Girardeau in June and July and August were a company of men that joined a larger regiment of men that had been enlisted in St. Louis. There was about 900 men up there. And the day that they were deployed from their training, they were inducted in it's called Benton Barracks, North County, St. Louis, about 7 miles from the river. It was a military training and installation barracks. It wasn't nothing fancy, boy, I'll tell you that. Many of the men got sick there. I don't know what barrack life is like. I've never been in the military, but this was not much more than a concentration camp in the 1940s kind of era. Those big bunks, and it was a place of disease and concentration of human beings that are not used to being together and not having mature immune systems, yeah. So sharing of new bugs took many men early.
Who wrote that article?
Well, it was the editor.
Looking fine in appearance and full of enthusiasm. He didn't look at the picture very well, did he?
Well, that's not his picture.
Oh, it's not his. Okay.
But I stole his quote. This is the editor of this newspaper in August of 1863. These men had enlisted, had been drilled, had been issued uniforms and second-rate muskets. They didn't have the best. And you're not surprised about that either. But the day that they were deployed, they were going to be sent to Arkansas, and they marched from Benton Barracks to the river levee in St. Louis to board 2 different steamships to go to Helena. At first, I wasn't even sure that anybody even noticed. But when I scoured this newspaper, and it's available in microfilm form at Kent Library, if you care to check my sources, this editor said, "The colored troops marched and handled their muskets in style that would do no discredit to approved white soldiers." So he said, you know, they handled themselves like any soldier. Really fine looking in appearance and full of enthusiasm and eagerness. What a glorious thing to say. Now, the people on the streets of St. Louis that day, in my mind's eye, I've just got to visualize it. I want a movie, you know, but yeah. I want to see them marching from Benton Barracks to the riverfront. This is the first regiment that was ever raised in Missouri. And I think there was a little shock and awe going on in the streets of St. Louis that day. The fact that there were military men marching up and down the street was nothing new. But when they got close enough to see their skin tone, what am I seeing? And although he had glowing things to say, I would guess the majority of the people on the street might have had something else to say. So it wasn't embraced, it wasn't cheered, it wasn't popular. There was some really ugly things said on the street, on the floor of Congress. This was not a popular event, but it happened. Well, I'm going to say one more thing about this picture, and I'm going to say it from my white middle-class female perspective. There's something that still lingers in our culture and society that when you see an amassed group of black faces with guns, with this kind of reaction to the camera, that kind of makes your heart go, okay, I'm owning it. I'm owning 200 years of what do we do about other? How do we live? How do we respond? How do we embrace or repel things that seem different? And the only difference here is their skin tone. But this is what's going on in society and culture of 1863. This is many white slave owners' worst nightmare. Uniformed in the uniform of my country, armed and equipped with real bullets to defend my country or to create an insurrection. Who knows how that could have gone? And the people that were most leery about armed black soldiers, and goodness gracious, this is 2 years into the war, a war that was at stalemate, a war that had so much destruction and loss of life that, you know, the two sides were deplete. They were about to fall apart because there was nobody left to fight. How are we going to push over the edge and restore and protect, preserve the Union? Armed black soldiers? Would it make a difference? Honestly, most of these men did not, well, these men did, but Missouri guys, again, I'm using their picture, but our story, most of our Missouri guys did not see battle. There's 1 or 2 units that actually fought in 2 or 3 battles, but the most of their 3-year service was garrison duty, guarding supplies, guarding prisoners. For the guys that went down to Helena, Arkansas, there was a big island full of trees, and there were woodcutters down there cutting wood to fuel the steamboats. They were protecting the woodcutters. You know, it was not glorious military service. But for their role, they did free up many other soldiers, Grant's army for one, to go ahead and bring the war to completion. So they served an important part, but it was not glorious. This is the story I feel compelled to tell. Because my first introduction to this ignored history was their enlistment record, their descriptive list, I knew them first by name, their physical description. I knew their slave owner's name, as painful but as revealing as that can be. And I knew from pulling together information from the slave holding family and this black military man a little about what he came from, where he lived, what he left, and what he came home to, if he lived. And this is the stuff of community memory. These are the families that in many cases came back to Cape Girardeau, established themselves around the county, in the city, Perry County, Scott County. And when you contrast this picture with this picture, it becomes more approachable, more honest, more what we trust, the love and devotion of family. Now, here's how I'm doing my research. I am taking all of the names of the men that I have found on enlistment records and muster rolls, and I can go to materials that are provided and stored in the National Archives that give complete information about the compiled military service record of these men, from the time of their enlistment to the regiment that they were assigned, what happened during that 3-year period, where they completed their military service, and then occasionally there are bonus things found in the military service record. When I find a letter, I don't want you to know, you just can't imagine how rare this is, but part of what happened for these men in this long 3-year enlistment that straddled some war years, but most of it was in Reconstruction, these guys had a chance to learn to read and write. That was part of their military life experience in their deployment sites. So occasionally you find these really wonderful, genuine letters. If they lived through the war, and if they did not, there was help for their widows to apply for and receive pension. And then you find a much more rounded story about their life. George English enlisted in Cape Girardeau in August of 1863, one of that earliest groups. George and his father, Peter, were enslaved by a man by the name of Thomas English. And if you're Baptist and you have any knowledge of some of the old Bethel Baptist church records, Thomas English is a pretty prominent man in that church's life. That's why I was pulled and attracted to this. In George English's in his military service record, I found this letter. It was not written by George, and I'm guessing you can't read it, and I had to really lean in to read it. Let me read it to you. It's written to Mr. Peter English, George's father, whom I'm guessing was illiterate, but he was living on Thomas English's farm, kind of in the Jackson area. It says, "Dear sir, your son George has enlisted for a soldier for the 3rd Arkansas Volunteers of African descent. He will leave the Cape." Don't you hate when they say the Cape? He's not from here, is he? "He will leave the Cape today or tomorrow for Helena, Arkansas. He wishes you to take care of his crop for him." It just brings a tear to my eye. Here's this 20-year-old kid, made his way to Cape, got enlisted, is getting to know his first lieutenant who's going to be in charge of his unit, a white man, a white officer, and here's the boat coming up the river. Please, sir, will you write a letter to my father? I need him to know where I am. And he has got his crop on his mind. And it's probably not his crop, it's probably Thomas's crop. George is a good boy, and I will use him as he deserves, as he is in the service of the United States. He will be treated like white soldiers are. Big promise, little action there. By the way, that's an aside. It is much better for him volunteering as he did than to be drafted in the military, in the militia, and made to work in the sewers, breastworks, or anything of that kind. His pay is $13 per month, and that was wrong. This young white first lieutenant still doesn't know how it's going to turn out. Actually, George got much less than that. $9 a month, and he had to pay for his uniform on top of that. And it goes on to say, and nothing will be expected for him to spend money on except for tobacco and things that he might want extra, and he goes on. But here's this letter laying in this man's military service record. George's mind is on his dad. Thomas only owned 2 slaves, Peter and George is gone. Noah Randall, I mentioned him before. I mentioned that here's the date, 1854, at age 36, he was sold on the courthouse steps in Jackson. The handbill said he had a value of $900. He was sold for $1,193 to Samuel Randall. And in these slave claims, for those that joined during that December to March time frame, in order for that slaveholder to get that compensation, he had to give the bill of sale. So we have all of these records laying in those military service records that show not only how the man acquired him, but sometimes you know the man's mother's name, or where he might have come, maybe with a slave owner family from Virginia or from North Carolina to Cape Girardeau. So then you're pushing way back in what you might be able to know or understand about that black family.
Was 44 years old, was that kind of old?
It was kind of old. And I told you how hale and hearty I felt like Noah must have been. Because not only was they did have a physician at the enlistment that kind of looked the guys over and decided whether they were eligible or not. Some were rejected because of health or deformities or whatever. But Randall was really one of the oldest men I've seen that actually enlisted and lived and then came home a veteran and came back to Cape Girardeau and lived.
You got to remember now, the intent was never for them to serve as soldiers. So they didn't have to be spry.
Well, and some of the history about this unit said that they were old, the whole unit was old men. Mm-hmm. But that was not the case. I think, the unit that Noah was at went and spent most of its time in Louisiana. And they, in Port Hudson and Morganza, those were not great places. And they did a lot of ditch digging. You're right, there wasn't a lot of military action, but there was much of the same hard labor that they did as slaves on farms, and maybe harder. But he lived, he advanced to corporal. And there's no indication that, most of the time if you see, now here's where the other prejudice comes. If you see a man who enlisted as a private, they stayed a private, particularly if their skin color was black. If they were yellow or mulatto, those were the ones that, if they advanced, maybe made corporal or first sergeant. And the units that seemed to have some more of the education opportunities when the men learned to read and write, that was part of the duty for those non-commissioned officers, was record keeping. And this was a problem for black regiments if there were a bunch of illiterate folks. I don't see that Noah, even in his later federal census listings for him, he did not read or write. So the fact that he was advanced to corporal says to me, again, he was a charismatic kind of guy who was a leader of men and was given that responsibility and advanced in pay and advanced in benefits as a veteran because he was advanced as a corporal in his service. In 1880, he is in the federal census living across the river for a while on a rented farm in Alexander County. But then his son, and he had a wife and at least 2 children when he enlisted. He left them, which is the other story. If you decide it's worth the risk to me to run to Cape or St. Louis and enlist, that leaves the other slave family members to answer, to fill the void. And there was a lot of incidences where overt abuse happened in retribution for that man who ran. So that was, can you imagine the conversation the night before for Noah and Cheney? Should I? Will I live? Will I come back? That's the human story and the courage and the bravery that emerges in these stories. But he does live. I can trace his family to 1940, and I'm working to find those descendants today because I want them to have the story. Noah is in a grave right there. Across the street, Fairmont Cemetery, Section C. Do you know why they call it Section C? It's the color. It's the northwest corner of that cemetery. Those are, by and large, African-American families. Noah is one of the oldest veterans' grave markers that's in that lawn. He died of course, he was older when he enlisted, so he died in 1890. And now I'm standing right in the middle of that intersection. You know where I am? The library is over here. This is Carruthers going
Dunklin's down there.
this way, yeah, and this is Dunklin down here. So this is that crossroads where you can kind of do a Y and go around by the mausoleum. You know where we are? Well, this and this is Ruth Caston says, I drive by there all the time and I see those, and she's got an eagle eye for the shape, the distinctive shape of veteran grave markers. And she says, I drive by them all the time and I salute. And she said, you might go down there and take a look. I have walked and walked and walked and walked the cemetery trying to find, I have found 11 United States Colored Troop veterans buried there. But there's a little swale right here, and there's 5 grave markers, and one's kind of tilted. This is Noah's grave marker.
Next to that tree.
Now, it's my plan. When is Veterans Day?
November 11th.
If you'd like to meet me there, I'm going to have little flags. This part of the cemetery is always neglected, but we're going to put flags on those veterans' graves this year. Okay?
Good.
I'll meet you there at about... Huh?
I'll pay for the flags, but I'm in St. Genevieve.
Okay. I'm going to do about 9 o'clock that morning. November 11th.
Tuesday, November 11th.
Oh my goodness, I'll have to find something.
Well, let's do it Monday then. We'll do it Monday so that they have the whole day with decorated graves. Now, this is by popular demand. Are you weary? Are you ready for me to shut up?
No.
I want to tell you, this is the personal stories that really fly my kite. Madison Frederick Ross enlisted in Cape Girardeau on June the 8th. He was a runaway from Commerce, Missouri. slave of James Ross. He showed up on that regimental list, and I've got his military service record. There was nothing distinctive about his military service, except he lived, and that's distinctive. But, it didn't really matter much to me. He was just another name of the 250 some. But when I discovered that in 1936, 37, during the Great Depression, the federal, what's it called? Help me now, you old timers. Workers' Progress Administration, WPA, yep, before that, yep. A government program that, those of you that are Republicans say, oh, don't pay, well, put him to work, put people to work in many, 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 many projects. And one of the most unusual project to me was that they hired groups of writers. And they had all kinds of assignments, but the one that I think is the most significant and lasting is the assignment of writers all across regions and counties to go into the highways and hedges and the alleys and the swales and look for old, and they were old, African American men and women who had been born into slavery. And do your best, knock on the door, and get an audience with these people, and transcribe the stories that they told about their lives in slavery. It's a strange collection, and I will warn you that many historians throw the whole thing out, say it's a farce, it's degrading, it's guided. They had a set of questions. The interviewer says, hello, ma'am, may I interview you? This is 1930s. Okay? Let's get that into context. White woman coming to your door. You're an old woman. Not right now, but you in your mind's eye. Would you let me in? This is the height of Jim Crow and some of those things. I'm going to ask you questions. Can I talk about slavery? Right. And so there's this dance.
Right, I'm going to say she's going to tell you what she thinks you want to hear.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
And
what's safe.
What's safe. And so because of that, a lot of folks say out the window. But when I became aware of the collection and I began to take a closer look at it, I need a testimony here in a minute, and saw who was approached in Cape Girardeau and Jackson and Sykeston, and read, and this is where it's difficult, because and this is the other thing that kind of questions its legitimacy, is because for better or for worse, these white writers, I think it was part of the assignment, it was to try to capture the dialect of the speaker. Okay? So this is not a great time of social relationship anyway. And so that's where it's almost like reading another language. Unless you can read it out loud and you kind of get into the rhythm of it, and then it sounds like grandma talking, in a way. And so it's somewhat endearing because it captures that old-time African-American dialect. And of course there's old-time Caucasian dialect and Cape Girardeau dialect and Charleston dialect. So it's not just, but it could be viewed as being very degrading. So with that warning, I'd encourage you to look at it. Madison opened the door to one of these writers, and his narrative is in here. And I guess he had nothing to lose. To some degree, I think he told it the way, and here's the other thing. Most of the people that were in the 30s who were still alive were children when they were slaves. And so they had not yet realized the full brunt of what it meant to be an adult slave. They were the kids of the plantation or the slave farm. Madison, however, was 18 when he enlisted. So he wasn't a child when he's thinking about slave days, although he talks about that. But I've learned and been able to expand his story mostly by his slave narrative. And it talks about life on the Ross farm in Commerce, and what he says about his enlistment is spot on with the regimental history. This man survives, comes back to Commerce, and his regiment, when they were in Arkansas in those Reconstruction years, there were Quakers, Society of Friends members who sent missionaries to Helena, Arkansas, to begin to meet the needs of the freed men and women of Phillips County, Arkansas. This is after the war. All these people are freed and have nowhere to go. No clothes, no food. They don't know how to read. They don't know how to write. And now they're going to be thrust into the life of freedom. And so these friends, Quakers, send missionaries to that area. They collaborate, and this wouldn't happen today, but they collaborate with these military forces. They create an orphanage. They create a school. They create a training institute for men and women, and they all learn to read and write together, the soldiers and the Quakers. So Madison takes his skills that he had developed and honed as a soldier back to Commerce, and he establishes a school himself after his military service in Commerce for black boys and girls and men and women. And we find him coming forward into the census as a school teacher. Oh, well, sorry about that. That was supposed to say community memory above. There, like I said, I have not been successful to find many pictures that depict our community memory. I have two. This is a picture. You might recognize where these men are walking. They're walking down Broadway, the north side of Broadway, coming down Broadway Hill toward the river, kind of where Katie O'Farrell's is. You know where that is?
Comes from the newspaper.
This is a photograph that was in the collection of Louis Kruger. It's owned by Scott Shivelbein. He shared it with me. Well, actually, Sharon Sanders made me aware of it, and then Scott shared it with me. This handwritten attribution is on the photograph. Comrades, Jake Rubel and John Gale. This is John, African-American man, and this is Jake. Arm in arm, walking down the street in 1914. John is one of the men who actually served in the Missouri military, militia, the light artillery. He was in a United States colored troop, and this is really the exception because he stayed local and fired the big guns here in Cape Girardeau. And he was a member of a Union Veterans organization along with Jake, and they had their picture made together. Now here's the other one. Oh wait, I didn't get my amen back here for the slave narratives. This is Steve Lee back here. He's going to become my assistant researcher. I found two of his great-grandfather's slave narratives in this book.
Wow.
And shared with him. Wesley was one of his grandparents, and Smokey Eulenberg. Smokey Eulenberg. Now, I'm going to tell you more about those slave narratives. I'm going to come back to this. But this is one of those knock your socks off kind of stories. I come back to Cape Girardeau, I ask all over town, does anybody know about African American soldiers from the Civil War? And one of the oldest people I know said, well, I kind of remember back when the People's Cafe was open on Good Hope Street? Good Hope and Frederick, kind of in there. That was an African American restaurant, one of the few African American owned restaurants, and primarily for African American clientele that goes back to the 30s, 40s, 50s, in operation till the 70s. Owned by J.T. Nelson and his wife. I mean, it's leaving me now. A long time revered and respected family in Cape Girardeau. But this old person said, it seemed to me that there was on the wall of the People's Cafe a picture of an African American soldier. Okay, that's gone. It's been gone 70 years, close, 40 years, 50 years. So I started asking around. Ed Pikes is kind of the other go-to guy for African American history in this town, and he says, well, if you really want to know people, how people are going to embrace your research, you need to go to Hardee's. Hardee's on William Street on a weekday morning between 8 and 10 or something like that. Yep, and sit with the group of African American men who drink coffee and gossip and whatever you do. And that's where I met Stephen. You know, I am so committed to this story that, you know, I'm really going to get outside my own comfort zone and try to get the story where the story belongs. And mine, the stories, the memory of the community, so that we can get it together and record it and remember it. And Stephen let me sit down and talk with him. That's when we discovered that he had ancestor stories in that collection. But another guy was kind of listening, and I'm asking about the People's Cafe picture. And Daryl Redden? Derek Redden. Jalen's a big football star right now on Cape Central football team. Redden family's been here a long time. The Nelson family's been here a long time. He sheepishly raises his hand like I'm a teacher in school, and he says, I believe I have that picture. And I said, oh my gosh, let's talk about it. And he said, well, you got to talk to my sister. And so again, white woman trudging into black history, you know, you gotta walk it on a very tight line, and your intention's got to be right. But I gained their trust, and they shared this picture with me. This is their maybe great-grandfather. I think it was JT's great-grandfather. Louis Napoleon Nelson. Strong name. Louis was enslaved by the Oldham family in Tennessee. James Olden was his owner, and he was a Confederate officer, which makes which makes Louis Napoleon one of the only community memories of African American Civil War soldiers that I can find in Cape Girardeau, and he's a Confederate. He's a Confederate. He went with his owner, with the 7th Tennessee Cavalry. He went as body servant and cook to his owner's son, James. But as the war went on and the needs pressed the unit, eventually he was handed a musket and he went into battle and served the Confederacy. He has the distinction, he died in 1934, but he had the distinction of being to 37 Confederate veteran reunions, wow, wearing his uniform and proudly living as a Confederate veteran. When he was buried in 1934 in Lauderdale County, Florida, he had a Confederate flag draping his casket, which is really antithetical to the whole thing, except that bravery and military service kind of doesn't know sides, you know, and loyalties. React.
Well, I don't really consider that a choice, though.
Well, probably not.
He didn't choose to be a Confederate soldier. He served because that's what he was bred to do. That was what he was.
And it boiled down to choosing to live, too,
Right.
and protecting the man.
Well, I mean, he went with his owner.
Yeah.
He didn't enlist.
No.
He went with his owner as a slave.
Yeah.
And when he was needed, he became a soldier.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't said, okay, brother, do you want to enlist? It said, here, this is now your job.
Right.
So it wasn't, you know.
Except that his choice then as a living veteran to continue all those years to associate.
Well, he earned that.
He did, and apparently his comrades honored that, or he wouldn't have been invited in. But this is very much the exception and not the rule. And I include him because I want to honor him, and that he is Cape Girardeau community memory, and deserves that honor.
I had a personal observation. You know, we as people, as humans, we relate to the people that we're around, that we're with.
Yeah.
You know, regardless of who they are, or where we are, or what we are, the people that we know and, you know, closely, you know their personalities, you talk to them, work with them daily. Those are the people, it's much easier to have loyalty to those. Having loyalty to a state, you know, or a nation like the
Or an ideal, or
ideology is,
right.
That's a different level, that's a different thing.
Well, Nelson, we honor you. So I'm busy writing the book I want to read. I could not find the book on the shelf that I want to read.
Yeah, that's the way they do it.
And I invite you to, if this rang a little bell for you and you want to join in, there's plenty of work to be done. And I wanted to make it a community project because it's our community memory, finally. So thank you. I appreciate your, I wanted to show you this. I do use a lot of online tools, and that gives me portability to do the research that I do. I do use Ancestry.com, especially after the war. I can follow these men forward in census records and community records, and so Ancestry gives me that accessibility. Fold 3 is kind of an arm of Ancestry.com, another subscription.
Yeah.
But it's all military records, and that's how I access the military service records. There's a big collection of books that are on the 3rd floor of Kent Library, 134, 50, I don't know, thousands, seems like, bound books called The Official Records of the War of the Rebellion. And if you really want to get into the military aspect of it and know regimental history and orders, and if you're into generals and all the names and that sort of thing, you can go to that document. There's not as much about the United States Colored Troop as on the whole, but it's there. And archival collections at Kent Library, the special collections there. I've been to the Missouri History Society in St. Louis. There's quite a bit of archival manuscripts there. And Columbia at the State Historical Society of Missouri. And what I would really encourage you to do as just an amateur, just maybe a curious George about some of these slave stories. There is a collection of this book. They were printed, and I'll pass it around. Even the way they printed it is just the typewritten manuscripts. I mean, there's nothing refined about this, but there's 16 volumes of this, and Missouri is volume 11. These books are at Kent Library. They were collected by an editor by the name of George Raywick. And it's called The American Slave. And volume 11 is where you find Missouri stories. But Third floor Kent Library, and as a taxpayer, you can check it out when I turn it back in. But more easy is to go to the Library of get your computer up, Google LOC, Library of Congress Slave Narratives, and that whole collection will come up, and you can search it by state and name. So if you want to look at Madison Frederick Ross, you can put Ross in there and find his and read that story, because I told you about it. But there's plenty of others. You can look at Stephen's grandfather's, Smokey, I think it's how it's written here, Smokey Eulenberg, which sounds awful German to me, and I never figured out how you...
Polish.
Polish? I got to know more about that story. His grandpa on his other side is Wesley, and Wes lived down on Bloomfield Road. We were talking about Bloomfield Road and the old Houck property. He's got some really good ghost stories about down there, but also some other stories. So there's another story by Harriet. Maybe it's, I have to look. Louise Duncan. That's her great aunt Hattie.
Stories for you.
And when I found that for her, she just came off the chair. It was really fun. So these are people that lived and breathed in Cape Girardeau County, and their stories, however skewed, you got to read them with a grain of salt, and then find survivors to find the real story. But those are some of the tools that I'm using for my research. And that's it. Thank you. Questions? You're very gracious to sit through all that. What questions do you